Are you all right?
Sometimes in life, people go through moments that seem so unbelievable that if someone told you they happened, you would probably dismiss them as the plot of a movie. But every once in a while, life has a way of weaving together heartbreak, hope, and coincidence so perfectly that even the people living through it struggle to believe what is happening. This is the story of a woman who spent years believing she had been forgotten by everyone except the two children who depended on her. It is the story of a man who quietly carried a promise from childhood into adulthood, refusing to let time erase the only family he had left. Most importantly, it is the story of a reunion, nearly 3 decades in the making, one that unfolded in the last place either of them expected. Before this story reaches its end, you'll understand how an anonymous landlord changed the life of a struggling single mother, why he chose to remain hidden for years after finding her, and why one small silver bracelet became the key to unlocking a past that had almost disappeared forever. What happened next would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy powerful stories of hope, resilience, family, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming documentaries. Now, let's begin where every unforgettable story begins. Not with answers, but with a question. What would you do if the person who had quietly protected your family for years turned out to be someone you had spent your entire life believing was gone forever? On a cold Monday morning in late November, Evelyn Mercer stood at her small kitchen table, staring at an envelope she had been avoiding for almost an hour. The apartment around her was spotless, despite showing the wear of many difficult years. Every chair had been repaired more than once. The coffee maker only worked if the handle was held down by hand. The refrigerator hummed loudly enough to fill the silence after her children left for school. Yet, despite the modest surroundings, the apartment felt warm because it had become a home built on determination rather than comfort. Evelyn had lived there for 5 years with her 14-year-old daughter, Lila, and her 10-year-old son, Owen. Since the sudden loss of her husband, Graham, 3 years earlier, every decision she made revolved around one goal. No matter how difficult life became, her children would never feel as though they had lost everything. She worked 2 jobs, slept only a few hours each night, skipped meals more often than anyone realized, and smiled through exhaustion because she believed that if she remained strong enough, perhaps her children would never fully understand how close they often came to losing the roof over their heads. With trembling fingers, Evelyn finally opened the envelope. As expected, it was another notice from Sloan Property Management. She had fallen behind on rent after Owen's recent hospital visits drained what little savings she still had. She prepared herself for another warning, another deadline, another reminder that she was running out of time. Instead, she found a single sentence that made no sense at all. Her outstanding balance had been paid in full. She read it again, then a third time. There was no explanation, no signature, no indication that anyone had stepped forward on her behalf. Confused, she immediately called the property management office, convinced a mistake had been made. The receptionist politely confirmed that the account was current. When Evelyn asked who had made the payment, the answer came exactly as calmly as before. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer. We aren't authorized to release that information." She thanked the woman, ended the call, and sat quietly at the kitchen table. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Someone had known she needed help before she asked for it. That afternoon, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Evelyn hurried through her shift in the hospital cafeteria before crossing town to begin her evening cleaning job. Between both jobs, she managed to pick up Lila and Owen from school, help with homework, prepare dinner, and reassure her children that everything was going to be all right, even though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. After putting them to bed, she found herself thinking again about the mysterious payment. It wasn't the first unexplained act of kindness her family had experienced. Months earlier, their broken furnace had been replaced almost immediately during the coldest week of winter. The year before that, an anonymous grocery voucher had arrived just days before Christmas. Whenever something in the apartment needed urgent repairs, approval always seemed to come faster than expected. At the time, she dismissed each event as fortunate timing. Now she began wondering whether those moments had been connected all along. Nearly 800 miles away, another person was ending a very different day. Inside a quiet office, overlooking the lights of a busy city, sat Evelyn Mercer, the founder of a successful real estate company that owned apartment buildings across several states. Employees admired him for his fairness, his generosity toward struggling tenants, and his unusual habit of personally reviewing hardship requests that most executives delegated to someone else. What almost no one knew was that one tenant file never left his desk. Printed across the front were 3 simple words: Evelyn Mercer. Callan opened the file one more time before leaving for the night. Inside were inspection reports, maintenance requests, payment histories, and handwritten notes from a private investigator named Nathan Harlow. Nathan's latest report was brief. Evelyn was still working 2 jobs. Owen's health had improved. Lila was doing well in school. The overdue rent had been paid as instructed. Callan closed the folder and looked toward a cedar box resting on the corner of his desk. Inside lay a faded photograph of 2 smiling children, a birthday card, and a tiny silver bracelet engraved with delicate flowers. He picked up the bracelet carefully and whispered words no one else had heard him say in almost 30 years. "I promised I'd find you, Evie." Then he switched off the office lights and walked into the night, unaware that the promise he had carried since childhood was closer to being fulfilled than ever before. The following week should have brought Evelyn Mercer a sense of relief. Her rent had been paid, the immediate threat of losing her home had disappeared, and for the first time in months, she could breathe without feeling the weight of another overdue bill pressing against her chest. Yet peace never arrived. Instead, a different feeling settled over her. It was the quiet, persistent feeling that someone knew far more about her life than they should. She wasn't frightened. She was puzzled. Whoever had helped her had done so without asking for recognition, without expecting gratitude, and without leaving behind even the smallest clue. Most acts of kindness came with a name attached. This one arrived wrapped in silence. Evelyn tried convincing herself to stop thinking about it, but every time she walked through the apartment, another unexplained memory surfaced. The leaking ceiling repaired within 24 hours after weeks of unanswered requests from other tenants. The refrigerator quietly replaced without any charge after it finally stopped working. The handwritten Christmas card that had accompanied the anonymous grocery voucher 2 years earlier. At the time, she assumed it had been sent by a local charity. Now she could no longer be certain. It felt as though invisible hands had been quietly keeping her family afloat whenever life threatened to pull them under. One Saturday morning, while helping Owen organize old school projects for a class assignment, Evelyn came across a faded envelope tucked inside a box of family keepsakes. It contained photographs taken before Graham's illness, back when laughter filled the apartment more often than silence. Owen smiled as he looked through them, pointing excitedly at pictures from family picnics and birthdays he barely remembered. Then he stopped at one image showing Graham lifting both children onto his shoulders. "Mom," he asked softly, "did Dad ever have a brother?" The question caught Evelyn completely off guard. "No," she answered after a moment. "At least, not that I know of." Owen nodded thoughtfully before returning the picture to the box. "I wish we had more family," he murmured. Evelyn forced a smile, but his words lingered in her thoughts long after the conversation ended. More family. She had wished for exactly the same thing countless times without realizing it. Growing up, she had always believed the emptiness she felt whenever people spoke about siblings or childhood memories was simply loneliness. She never considered the possibility that those missing pieces might actually exist somewhere beyond her memory. Across the country, Evelyn Mercer sat in a conference room, listening to senior executives discuss expansion plans for another luxury apartment development. Numbers filled the presentation screens, investment forecasts were debated, profits were projected years into the future. Yet Callan's attention wandered repeatedly toward the folder resting beside him. After the meeting ended, Nathan Harlow quietly followed him into his office. The two men had worked together for more than a decade, but their relationship had long evolved beyond business. Nathan had become the only person who truly understood why one successful businessman continued carrying the weight of a promise made by a frightened 10-year-old boy. "You paid her rent again," Nathan observed. Callan nodded. "She would have lost the apartment." Nathan folded his arms thoughtfully. "You know this can't continue forever." Callan walked toward the window overlooking the city skyline. "I know." Nathan hesitated before asking the question that had remained unspoken for years. "Then why haven't you told her?" Callan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the cedar box resting on the bookshelf behind his desk. Carefully lifting the old photograph, he stared at the smiling little girl holding his hand. "Because every time I decide, today's the day," he replied quietly, "I imagine someone knocking on her door and telling her everything she believes about her childhood is incomplete. I imagine the confusion, the anger, the grief. Then I convince myself one more month will make it easier." Nathan lowered his voice. "Has it?" Callan closed the photograph and slowly shook his head. "No, it never gets easier." Meanwhile, Evelyn's curiosity finally overcame her hesitation. On her next rent payment, instead of mailing the check, she visited Sloan Property Management in person. The office manager, Marjorie Sloan, greeted her warmly. Everyone who rented from the company knew Marjorie as a patient woman who somehow remembered every tenant's name. After processing the payment, Evelyn gathered enough courage to ask the question that had occupied her thoughts for days. "Can I ask you something?" Marjorie smiled. "Of course." Evelyn lowered her voice slightly. "Who owns the building?" For the first time since the conversation began, Marjorie's smile faded into something more thoughtful. "That's a question I hear surprisingly often," she admitted. "The owner prefers staying out of the public eye." Evelyn laughed softly. "I've lived there for 5 years, and I've never seen him." Marjorie nodded. "Most tenants haven't." Evelyn hesitated before continuing. "Did he pay my rent?" Marjorie remained silent, just long enough for Evelyn to realize she had touched on something important. Finally, she answered carefully, "I'm not permitted to discuss financial matters involving other people." It wasn't a denial, it wasn't a confirmation either, but it was enough to convince Evelyn that someone inside the company knew exactly what had happened. That evening, Marjorie made a phone call she hadn't expected to make for several months. When Callan answered, she explained that Evelyn had visited the office, asking questions about the property's owner. Callan listened without interrupting. "She suspects something," Marjorie concluded. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds before Callan finally replied. "She deserves answers." Marjorie smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time." Callan thanked her and ended the call. But instead of returning to work, he unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a thick leather journal. Inside were handwritten entries spanning nearly 30 years. Some described every lead that ended in disappointment. Others recorded birthdays he imagined celebrating with a sister he couldn't find. One page, dated only 5 years earlier, contained a sentence written more heavily than the rest, as though the pen had lingered over every word. "Today, I finally found Evelyn." Beneath it appeared another sentence, added only minutes later. "I don't know how to tell her." He closed the journal and rested both hands on its worn cover. For all the success he had achieved, this remained the one problem money, influence, and determination had never solved. The next afternoon, while cleaning out a storage cabinet at the hospital where she worked, Evelyn struck up a conversation with an elderly volunteer named Ruth. They had known each other casually for years, often exchanging greetings during busy shifts. Somehow, the conversation drifted toward childhood memories, and before long, Evelyn found herself admitting that she remembered very little about the years before she came to live with Aunt Lorraine. Ruth listened quietly before asking a simple question. "Have you ever requested your childhood records?" Evelyn frowned. "I didn't know I could." Ruth nodded. "You'd be surprised how many answers are sitting in courthouse files, waiting for someone to ask the right question." Evelyn thanked her politely, but the suggestion followed her throughout the rest of the day. By the time she returned home, she had already decided what she would do on her next day off. She would visit the courthouse and begin searching for whatever remained of the childhood she had almost completely forgotten. She had no idea that the first file she opened would contain a single sentence capable of changing everything she believed about her life, or that somewhere, hundreds of miles away, the brother she couldn't remember was preparing himself for the conversation he had feared for nearly 3 decades. Evelyn hardly slept the night before her visit to the courthouse. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself replaying Ruth's simple suggestion. For years, she had accepted the gaps in her childhood as something that could never be filled. She had convinced herself that memories faded naturally, and that there was no reason to disturb the past. Yet now, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she felt drawn toward it. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a quiet conviction that somewhere inside those forgotten years lay an answer to questions she had been asking without realizing it. The following morning, after dropping Lila and Owen at school, she drove to the county courthouse carrying only her purse and a notebook. The records department occupied a quiet corner of the old building where shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, holding decades of documents that had outlived the people who created them. An elderly clerk listened patiently as Evelyn explained what she was searching for. After checking several databases, he disappeared into a storage room before returning with a thin folder whose edges had yellowed with age. "This is all that's available publicly," he explained. "Some juvenile records remained sealed, and others were transferred years ago. I'm afraid a number of files were also destroyed during an archive flood." Evelyn thanked him, though disappointment settled over her almost immediately. She had hoped for answers. Instead, it seemed she would receive only fragments. The first pages contained routine paperwork documenting temporary guardianship, emergency housing, and court scheduling notices. Much of the language was formal and difficult to follow, but one detail immediately caught her attention. The surname listed throughout the documents wasn't Mercer. It was Mercerson, a name she had never heard before. Confused, she continued reading until she reached a handwritten amendment explaining that, following the guardianship proceedings, her surname had been legally shortened to Mercer for administrative consistency. Evelyn stared at the page in disbelief. Even her own name had once been different. She turned another page and found a report summarizing the events following a devastating house fire that had left 2 young children without stable guardianship after further family tragedy. Her breathing slowed as she reached the final paragraph. One sentence stood alone beneath the others. "Sibling placement unavailable due to emergency transfer." Evelyn read it again, then again. The words refused to make sense. Sibling placement. Her hands began trembling. She looked around the quiet room, almost expecting someone to tell her she had misunderstood. Instead, she sat frozen, realizing that Aunt Lorraine's recent confession had not been based on fading memories or family rumors. It had been documented from the very beginning. She had not grown up alone. Somewhere, somehow, she had once had a brother. Nearly 1,000 miles away, Evelyn Mercer was standing in front of another reminder of the past. Hidden inside a climate-controlled archive beneath his company's headquarters stood a single filing cabinet unlike every other in the building. While the rest of the archives contained contracts, financial statements, and property deeds, this cabinet held only one subject: Evelyn. He unlocked the top drawer and removed a thick binder labeled Search Timeline. Each section represented a different year. There were copies of investigator reports, adoption inquiries, court correspondence, interviews with retired social workers, and handwritten notes made during trips across the country following even the smallest lead. Nathan Harlow entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept," he observed. Callan accepted the coffee with a tired smile. "I haven't." Nathan glanced toward the open binder. "Thinking about her again?" Callan let out a slow breath. "I never stopped." Nathan sat opposite him. "Marjorie called this morning?" Callan immediately looked up. "What happened?" Nathan hesitated. "Evelyn went to the courthouse." The words settled heavily between them. Callan already understood what that meant. The search he had spent years trying to control had finally begun moving on its own. Whether he was ready or not, the truth was already finding its way toward his sister. Evelyn drove directly from the courthouse to Aunt Lorraine's farmhouse. She barely remembered the journey. Her thoughts remained fixed on the single sentence that had changed everything. When Lorraine opened the front door, she immediately noticed the folder clutched tightly against Evelyn's chest. "You found something," she said quietly. Evelyn nodded, unable to hide the emotion in her voice. "You told me I had a brother." Lorraine lowered her eyes. "Yes." Evelyn stepped inside and carefully placed the folder on the dining table. "Why didn't anyone ever tell me the whole story?" Lorraine sank slowly into a chair, her shoulders carrying the visible weight of memories she had spent decades trying to protect. Because the adults thought forgetting would hurt less than remembering. Evelyn sat across from her. "Did he survive?" Lorraine looked up, surprised by the question. "Of course he survived." Evelyn's eyes widened. "Then where is he?" Lorraine shook her head sadly. "That's the question we've all lived with for almost 30 years. She explained that after the tragedies which shattered the family, different relatives stepped forward at different times. Court orders changed. Counties transferred responsibility. Records disappeared. By the time anyone realized the siblings had been permanently separated, nobody seemed able to determine where the older boy had gone. Some believed he had been adopted by distant relatives in another state. Others believed he entered foster care under a different name. Every lead eventually disappeared. Lorraine's voice broke as she added, "I prayed for years that one day he'd come looking for you." That evening, after putting Lila and Owen to bed, Evelyn opened the small cardboard box containing the few belongings she had carried from childhood. She had searched through it countless times over the years, without discovering anything remarkable. Tonight felt different. Every object suddenly seemed capable of holding forgotten meaning. Beneath several photographs and old report cards lay the tiny silver bracelet she had found. This time she examined it more closely. Inside the band, almost too small to notice, was a single engraved letter. The letter E. She frowned, wondering why a child would receive jewelry engraved with only an initial. Then she noticed something else. The floral pattern ended abruptly along one side, almost as though it had once continued onto another matching piece. A strange feeling settled over her. She couldn't explain it, but she found herself wondering whether somewhere another bracelet existed, carrying the same flowers and another letter. At that exact moment, Callan Mercer was sitting alone in his office, holding its twin. His bracelet bore the letter C. He ran his thumb gently across the worn engraving before placing it beside the faded photograph of 2 smiling children. "I think she's remembering," he whispered to himself. He had no way of knowing that only minutes earlier, Evelyn had reached exactly the same conclusion from the opposite side of the country. Two matching bracelets, two lives forever connected, two siblings moving steadily toward a reunion. Neither of them could stop now, even if they wanted to. For the next several days, Evelyn found herself moving through life almost mechanically. She smiled at coworkers when they greeted her, helped patients in the hospital cafeteria with the same kindness she always had, and listened patiently as Owen excitedly described his latest science project. Outwardly, nothing about her routine had changed. Inside, however, everything felt different. Every quiet moment was filled with questions that refused to leave her alone. If she truly had a brother, had he ever searched for her? Had he built a family of his own? Was he still alive? Or had he spent his life believing she had forgotten him? Those questions followed her everywhere, making it difficult to concentrate even on the simplest tasks. One afternoon, while washing dishes after the lunch rush, she accidentally dropped an entire tray of plates. The crash echoed through the cafeteria, startling everyone nearby. Her supervisor hurried over, expecting to find someone injured. Instead, she found Evelyn standing motionless, tears quietly filling her eyes. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Embarrassed, Evelyn apologized and blamed exhaustion, but deep down, she knew that wasn't the truth. She wasn't simply tired. She was grieving someone she couldn't remember and missing a relationship she had only just discovered had once existed. That same evening, Evelyn Mercer made a decision he had postponed for nearly 5 years. He asked Nathan Harlow to arrange a meeting with every investigator, attorney, and family counselor who had assisted in the search over the years. By the following morning, they were seated around a large conference table inside the company's headquarters. Some of them had worked on the case for more than a decade. Others had joined only recently after new records surfaced. Callan looked around the room before speaking. "Evelyn knows she had a brother," he began quietly. She started looking through court records. Several people exchanged knowing glances. Nathan leaned forward. "Then we're out of time." Callan nodded slowly. "I think you're right." One of the counselors, a woman named Dr. Celeste Warren, spoke next. She had spent years helping families navigate emotional reunions after long separations. "You've prepared for this conversation longer than anyone I've ever met," she said. "But I want you to remember something important. You're imagining a perfect reunion because you've carried this hope since you were 10 years old. Reality will be more complicated. She may cry, she may be angry, she may need time to believe you. None of those reactions mean she doesn't love you. They simply mean she's trying to rebuild an entire childhood in a single afternoon." Callan listened carefully. "What if she asks why I waited?" Dr. Warren answered honestly. "Then tell her the truth. Don't defend yourself. Don't justify every decision. Let her see your heart." Meanwhile, Evelyn's search uncovered another unexpected lead. Ruth, the elderly volunteer at the hospital, introduced her to a retired social worker named Walter Briggs, who had spent more than 40 years working in family services before his retirement. Walter no longer had access to confidential records, but he remembered the chaos surrounding emergency placements decades earlier. After listening to Evelyn's story, he sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "Back then," he explained, "our system wasn't what it is today. During emergencies, children were sometimes transferred across county lines within hours. Paper files traveled by mail. If one folder was misplaced or delayed, families could spend years searching in the wrong places." Evelyn listened carefully as Walter continued. "I remember one particular case involving a brother and sister separated after several tragedies struck the same family. The older boy refused to stop asking where his little sister had gone. Evelyn felt her heart pounding. "Do you remember his name?" Walter closed his eyes, searching memories buried beneath decades of other cases. Finally, he shook his head with visible disappointment. "No, I wish I did, but I remember something else." Every time we spoke with him, he repeated the same sentence. Evelyn leaned forward. "What did he say?" Walter smiled sadly. "He kept telling everyone, 'I'll find her. I promised I would.'" The words struck Evelyn with unexpected force. She didn't know why, but hearing that simple promise filled her with emotions she couldn't explain. It sounded less like a child's wish and more like a vow someone had spent a lifetime trying to keep. Later that night, after Leela and Owen were asleep, Evelyn sat alone by the living room window, turning the silver bracelet slowly between her fingers. Outside, the apartment courtyard was quiet, except for the occasional passing car. She found herself wondering whether somewhere another person might be looking at a matching bracelet at that exact same moment. It felt like an impossible thought, yet she couldn't dismiss it. She opened her notebook and began writing every clue she had gathered so far. A brother, a courthouse record confirming their separation, a mysterious landlord who seemed unusually interested in her family's well-being, anonymous acts of kindness stretching back years, matching initials engraved inside childhood jewelry. Individually, none of those details explained anything. Together, they seemed to point toward a truth she still couldn't quite see. Before closing the notebook, she wrote one final question across the bottom of the page. "Who has been watching over us all this time?" She stared at those words for several minutes before switching off the light, completely unaware that the answer to her question had already booked a flight to her city. The following morning, Callan boarded a plane carrying only a small leather bag, the faded childhood photograph, the matching silver bracelet, and a sealed envelope that had remained locked inside his desk for years. Nathan met him at the airport before departure. "Are you certain about this?" he asked. Callan looked through the terminal windows as the first rays of sunlight reflected against the aircraft waiting on the runway. "I've spent 28 years searching for my sister," he replied quietly. "If I get back on this plane without meeting her, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened." Nathan smiled. "Then go keep your promise." As the aircraft lifted into the morning sky, Callan closed his eyes and thought back to the final day he remembered clearly before everything changed. He saw a frightened 5-year-old girl gripping his hand so tightly that her tiny fingers hurt. He remembered kneeling in front of her and making a promise he barely understood himself. "No matter where they take us," he had whispered, "I'll find you again." Nearly 3 decades had passed since those words were spoken. Now, with every mile, the plane carried him closer to Evelyn. The promise that had shaped his entire life was finally about to be tested. Neither of them knew that within 48 hours they would be sitting face to face, and that the first question Evelyn asked him would be the one Callan had feared answering for almost 30 years. By the time Callan's flight landed, Evelyn had no idea that the answer to every question she had been asking was now less than an hour away. She spent the morning exactly as she had spent hundreds of mornings before, stocking shelves in the hospital cafeteria, greeting regular visitors with a warm smile, and quietly calculating how much of her next paycheck would remain after groceries, utilities, and Owen's follow-up medical appointment. Even after the mysterious rent payment, money remained painfully tight. She had become so accustomed to carrying the weight of responsibility alone that she no longer noticed how exhausted she truly was. During her lunch break, she sat outside on a weathered bench with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. As she opened her notebook to review the clues she had collected, her phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed Sloan Property Management. She answered immediately, expecting another routine conversation about the apartment. Instead, Marjorie Sloan spoke in a calm, unusually careful voice. "Mrs. Mercer, I hope I'm not interrupting your day. The owner of your building will be in town tomorrow. He has asked if you would be willing to meet him." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "He wants to meet me?" she asked. Yes, Marjorie replied. He believes it's time. Evelyn remained silent for several moments before quietly agreeing. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at the property management office. After ending the call, she stared across the hospital parking lot, unable to explain why a simple meeting with a landlord suddenly felt like the most important appointment of her life. Meanwhile, Callan checked into a modest hotel just a few miles from the apartment building. The choice surprised Nathan, who had expected him to reserve a luxury suite as he usually did during business trips. Callan simply smiled and said, "This isn't a business trip." Once inside his room, he placed the leather bag on the bed and carefully removed its contents: the faded photograph, the silver bracelet, the cedar box, the sealed envelope. Finally, he unfolded a letter he had rewritten dozens of times over the past 5 years. It began with the words, "Dear Evelyn," and ended with, "I'm sorry, it took me so long to find the courage to stand in front of you." He read it one final time before folding it neatly and returning it to the envelope. He knew there was a chance he would never need to hand it to her. If the conversation went well, perhaps the words would simply be spoken aloud. But if emotion overwhelmed him, the letter would say everything he feared he might not be able to. Looking at his reflection in the hotel mirror, Callan realized something that surprised him. He wasn't worried about whether Evelyn would recognize him. He was worried about whether she would ever forgive him. That evening, Evelyn drove to Aunt Lorraine's farmhouse one last time before the meeting. She hadn't planned on going there, but something inside her insisted she needed to see the woman who had raised her. Lorraine welcomed her with the same gentle smile she had worn for decades, though she immediately sensed the nervousness in Evelyn's face. After listening to everything that had happened, she remained quiet for a long time before disappearing into the hallway. When she returned, she carried a small wooden box Evelyn had never seen before. "I've been waiting for the right time to give you this," Lorraine said softly. Inside lay a handful of old photographs, several birthday cards, and a tiny drawing made with crayons. The paper had become fragile with age, but one detail remained perfectly clear. It showed a little boy holding hands with a little girl beneath a bright yellow sun. Across the top, written in uneven childish handwriting, were the words, "Me and Evie forever." Evelyn covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. "He drew this," Lorraine nodded. "The day before everything changed." Beneath the drawing was another item, a folded newspaper clipping describing the house fire that had altered their lives forever. This version contained a photograph that had never appeared in the courthouse records. Though grainy, it clearly showed 2 children sitting together on the front steps, wrapped in blankets, while emergency workers moved around them. The little boy had one arm protectively around the little girl. Evelyn stared at the picture, and for the first time in nearly 30 years, the face beside her own no longer looked like that of a stranger. It looked familiar. She barely slept that night. Every few hours, she found herself looking again at the drawing with the words, "Me and Evie forever." She traced the letters gently with her fingertips, wondering whether the little boy who had written them still remembered making that promise. Somewhere across town, Callan was experiencing the same restless night. He had abandoned any hope of sleeping and instead sat beside the hotel window, watching the city lights fade as dawn slowly approached. Memories he had spent years carefully controlling now returned one after another. He remembered teaching Evelyn how to whistle, even though she never quite managed it. He remembered giving her the larger half of every chocolate bar because she always smiled when she thought she had received more. He remembered the final moment they saw each other inside the county office after the fire. She had been crying so hard that she could barely breathe, reaching toward him while strangers gently pulled them apart. He had shouted the only words he could think of, "I'll find you." For years, he wondered whether she had heard him. Tomorrow, he might finally discover the answer. The following afternoon arrived with remarkable calm. Evelyn arrived at Sloan Property Management 10 minutes early, dressed in the only navy blazer she reserved for important occasions. Marjorie greeted her warmly and escorted her into a quiet conference room overlooking the courtyard. "He'll be here shortly," she said, before gently closing the door behind her. Alone in the room, Evelyn noticed a framed photograph hanging on the wall showing the apartment building shortly after its renovation several years earlier. Beneath it was a small plaque bearing the words, "A home should always be a place where hope begins." She found herself reading the sentence several times. Something about it reminded her of the anonymous kindness her family had received over the years. Moments later, footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. They were slow, steady, and unhurried. The conference room door opened. A tall man stepped inside, carrying a worn leather bag. Their eyes met instantly. Neither spoke. For a few extraordinary seconds, the room seemed to disappear around them. Evelyn couldn't explain why the stranger standing before her felt strangely familiar, or why tears suddenly gathered in his eyes before a single word had been exchanged. Callan looked at the woman he had spent nearly 3 decades searching for, and realized that every mile, every unanswered question, every disappointment, and every promise had led to this one unforgettable moment. Taking a slow breath to steady his voice, he finally spoke the words he had rehearsed countless times, yet never truly believed he would have the chance to say. "Hello, Evie. I've been trying to find my way back to you for almost 30 years. For a brief moment, Evelyn couldn't move. The name Evie settled over the room with a familiarity that reached somewhere deeper than memory. Almost no one had ever called her that. Graham had always called her Evelyn. Her co-workers called her Mrs. Mercer, or simply Eve. Aunt Lorraine had occasionally used the nickname when speaking about her childhood, but hearing it from a complete stranger stirred something she couldn't explain. It wasn't recognition in the ordinary sense. It was something quieter, something that seemed to bypass thought altogether and settled directly into her heart. She stared at the man standing before her, searching his face for answers. His eyes were filled with emotion, yet there was no expectation in them, no demand that she immediately believe what he was about to say. There was only hope, fragile enough that she could almost see how carefully he had carried it through the years. Finally, Evelyn found her voice. "How do you know that name?" she asked. Callan took one careful step forward, but stopped several feet away, wanting to give her every opportunity to feel safe. "Because," he answered softly, "when you were little, you refused to answer anyone who called you Evelyn. You insisted everyone call you Evie. You told Mom that Evelyn sounded too grown up." Evelyn felt a chill travel through her body. She had no memory of saying those words, yet somehow, hearing them felt strangely right. Callan slowly placed the worn leather bag on the conference table and unzipped it. He wasn't reaching for legal documents or identification. Instead, he carefully removed 3 items and laid them side by side. The faded photograph, the crayon drawing that read, "Me and Evie forever," and finally, the matching silver bracelet, engraved with the letter C. Evelyn instinctively reached into her handbag and removed her own bracelet. Without saying a word, she placed it beside his. The floral engravings aligned perfectly, almost as though they had been waiting years to be reunited. Neither bracelet was valuable. Together, they became priceless. Evelyn picked up the photograph with trembling hands. For several long moments, she simply stared at the faces of 2 smiling children sitting on old wooden porch steps. Then, almost without realizing it, she smiled through her tears. "I remember those steps," she whispered. "Not clearly, but I remember sitting there." Callan nodded, his own voice growing quieter. "Dad built them himself. Every summer we'd sit there eating watermelon until Mom called us inside." Another memory surfaced unexpectedly. Evelyn laughed softly through her tears. "You always stole my watermelon." Callan blinked in surprise before laughing himself. "No," he corrected gently, "you always gave me yours, because you only wanted the seeds to spit across the yard." They both stopped speaking. Neither of them had expected such a small memory to survive the passage of nearly 30 years. Yet there it was, waiting patiently until they found each other again. Evelyn looked at him for what felt like the first time. She noticed the same gentle eyes she had seen reflected in old photographs of their father. The same smile that somehow felt both familiar and entirely new. Then she asked the question that mattered more than any other. "Are you really my brother?" Callan reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a certified copy of the family records Nathan had spent years assembling. Birth certificates, court transfers, DNA confirmation obtained after locating a preserved medical sample from one of Evelyn's childhood hospital visits. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. He slid them gently across the table. "I didn't want you to have to take my word for it," he said quietly. Evelyn looked through the papers one by one. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no room left for doubt. Tears rolled silently down her face as she lowered the final page. Looking back at Callan, she whispered the single word he had dreamed of hearing for nearly 3 decades. "Brother." The room fell silent. Callan closed his eyes briefly, overcome by emotion. He had imagined this moment thousands of times. In none of those imagined reunions had the word carried as much meaning as it did now. Yet, even as relief settled between them, another question rose almost immediately. Evelyn wiped away her tears and looked directly into his eyes. "If you found me," she began slowly, "why did you wait?" There was no anger in her voice yet, only confusion. Callan had known this question was coming. It was the one he feared more than any other, because there was no simple answer. He sat down across from her and folded his hands together before speaking. "I found you 5 years ago," he admitted quietly. Evelyn's expression changed instantly. "5 years?" He nodded. "At first I wasn't completely certain. We spent months confirming everything, because I couldn't risk walking into a stranger's life. Then I learned about Graham." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "He was already sick." Callan nodded again. "The investigators told me he was fighting for his life. Every family counselor I spoke with warned me that introducing myself during that time could overwhelm you when your entire world was already falling apart. They advised me to wait." Evelyn listened without interrupting. "Then Graham passed away," Callan continued. "I thought I'd come then. But you were trying to hold your children together. Owen became ill. Bills were piling up. Every time I convinced myself it was finally the right moment, another hardship appeared. I kept telling myself I'd help quietly until life became a little easier for you. I thought I was protecting you." His voice broke slightly. "Instead, I stole 5 more years from us." Evelyn looked away toward the window. The revelation hurt more than she expected. For years she had cried herself to sleep, believing she was completely alone. She remembered sitting beside hospital beds, struggling to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, wondering why life seemed determined to test her over and over again. All that time, her brother had known where she was. He had been close enough to help, but not close enough to hold her hand. She wanted to understand his reasons. She truly did. Yet another part of her couldn't ignore the years they had lost. The silence stretched between them, until Callan quietly reached into the leather bag once more. This time, he removed a thick bundle of envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. "These are yours," he said. Evelyn frowned. "What are they?" He smiled sadly. "Letters." She untied the ribbon and opened the first envelope. It was dated almost 5 years earlier, only weeks after Graham's funeral. The first line read, "Dear Evelyn, you don't know me yet, but I've been looking for you since I was 10 years old." She looked at the next envelope. then another. There were dozens of them. Birthdays, Christmases, Mother's Day, the anniversary of Graham's passing. Every important moment during the past 5 years had been marked by another letter Callan had written but never mailed. Evelyn slowly looked back at him. "You wrote all of these?" He nodded. "Every time I wanted to knock on your door, I wrote instead. I thought one day, when the time was finally right, I'd give them to you, so you'd know I never stopped thinking about you." Evelyn held the letters tightly against her chest. They could never replace the years they had lost, but they proved something she had never expected to discover. She had never truly been forgotten. Even during her loneliest nights, somewhere not too far away, her brother had been writing to the sister he refused to stop loving. Evelyn held the bundle of letters in both hands, as though they might disappear if she loosened her grip. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between brother and sister was no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with 30 years of words that had never been said, birthdays that had never been celebrated together, and memories that had been interrupted before either of them understood how precious they would become. Finally, Evelyn untied the ribbon again and opened another envelope. This one had been written on the day Lila graduated from elementary school. "Nathan sent me a picture today," Callan had written. "She has your smile." I wanted to clap louder than anyone else in that auditorium, but I stayed away because I wasn't ready to explain why a stranger was crying in the back row. Evelyn stopped reading and looked up slowly. "You were there?" Callan nodded, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. "I stood near the last row, where no one would notice me. You were sitting in the front, cheering louder than anyone. I remember thinking how proud Mom would have been, watching you become the kind of mother she always hoped you would be." Evelyn lowered the letter and covered her mouth. She remembered that graduation. She even remembered noticing a man standing alone near the exit before everyone began leaving, but she had never given him another thought. The realization that her brother had quietly shared one of her happiest moments without revealing himself left her overwhelmed. She continued opening the letters one after another. Each one revealed another chapter of the life Callan had witnessed from a distance. There was a letter, written after Owen's surgery, thanking God that the operation had been successful. Another described the day Evelyn worked a double shift before walking nearly 3 miles home because her car had broken down. One Christmas letter admitted that he had spent nearly an hour sitting in his parked car across the street, simply watching the lights inside her apartment. "You were decorating the tree with the children," he had written. "The ornaments didn't match. Half the lights weren't working. But I've never seen a home filled with more love." Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as she realized these weren't the observations of a wealthy landlord checking on a tenant. They were the quiet thoughts of an older brother trying to remain connected to the only family he had left. Every letter carried the same closing sentence: "I hope next year I'll finally be brave enough to knock on your door." Yet, year after year, the letters remained sealed. Evelyn gently placed them back on the table. "You weren't protecting yourself," she whispered. "You really believed you were protecting me." Callan looked down before answering. "I made the wrong choice. I know that now. But every decision came from love, not fear of being rejected." The office door opened softly as Marjorie Sloane stepped inside, carrying a tray with fresh coffee. She immediately sensed that something extraordinary had happened. Without interrupting, she quietly placed the tray on a side table. As she turned to leave, Evelyn stopped her. "Marjorie?" The older woman smiled warmly. "Yes?" Evelyn's voice trembled. "How long have you known?" Marjorie looked toward Callan before answering honestly. 5 years. Evelyn wasn't angry. She simply wanted to understand. "And you kept his secret?" Marjorie nodded slowly. "Only because I promised him I would. I watched him struggle with this decision almost every day. There were times he drove all the way here, intending to introduce himself, only to turn around before reaching your apartment because he convinced himself it wasn't the right moment. She smiled gently through tears of her own. I've worked in property management for more than 30 years. I've met hundreds of landlords. Most of them worried about buildings. Callan only ever worried about one tenant. After Marjorie quietly left the room, Evelyn looked back at her brother. Was it really you? She asked. The furnace, the groceries, the repairs? Callan smiled faintly. Every one of them. Evelyn laughed softly through her tears. There was one winter when the furnace broke in the middle of a snowstorm. The repairman arrived before sunrise. He told me he'd never received an emergency approval that quickly. Callan chuckled, because I approved it myself at 2 o'clock that morning. She shook her head in disbelief. And the Christmas groceries? I knew you wouldn't accept money directly, he admitted. So I asked Marjorie to make it look like a community donation. For the first time since the conversation began, Evelyn stood up and slowly walked around the table. She stopped directly in front of Callan. Neither of them knew what to say anymore. Words suddenly seemed far too small for everything they had both carried over the years. Then, without hesitation, Evelyn wrapped her arms around him. Callan froze for only an instant before embracing his little sister with tears streaming freely down his face. It wasn't a polite hug between strangers. It was the embrace of two children who had finally found each other after spending most of their lives believing the other had been lost forever. Neither noticed how long they remained standing there. The years between them seemed to disappear with every passing second. When they finally stepped back, Evelyn smiled through tears. You kept your promise. Callan laughed softly. I was a little late. Evelyn gently shook her head. No, you came back. Later that afternoon, they drove together to apartment 3B. Callan insisted on following Evelyn's car rather than arriving separately. As they pulled into the parking lot, children were riding bicycles between the buildings while neighbors chatted outside beneath the autumn sun. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, yet for Evelyn, nothing about the day felt ordinary anymore. Inside the apartment, Lila and Owen looked up from the living room as the front door opened. They immediately noticed the unfamiliar man standing beside their mother. Evelyn smiled warmly. There's someone I'd like you both to meet. Lila stepped forward first, her curiosity evident. Owen remained beside the sofa, studying the visitor carefully. Evelyn rested a gentle hand on Callan's shoulder before speaking the words she had never imagined she would have the chance to say. This is my brother, your uncle. The children looked at each other in complete surprise. You have a brother? Owen asked. Evelyn laughed through happy tears. I didn't know until today. Callan knelt so he was at eye level with them. I've wanted to meet both of you for a very long time. Lila smiled politely. Mom says family always tells the truth. Callan nodded. She's right. Lila thought for a moment before asking the question only a teenager would think to ask. So, does this mean you've been the mysterious landlord all along? Callan couldn't help laughing. I suppose it does. Owen's eyes grew wide. Wait, you're the one who fixed the basketball hoop last summer? Callan grinned. I may have had a little help. The room filled with laughter for the first time that day, and in that ordinary apartment where Evelyn had spent years believing she was completely alone, a family that had once been broken apart quietly began learning how to become whole again. Yet before the day ended, Callan still had one final surprise waiting, one that would ensure his sister and her children would never again have to fear losing the place they called home. As the laughter slowly faded, the apartment settled into a comfortable silence that felt surprisingly natural. Callan looked around the small living room with quiet admiration. It wasn't large, and it certainly wasn't luxurious, but every corner reflected Evelyn's determination to create a loving home despite years of hardship. Family photographs lined one wall. School certificates hung proudly in inexpensive frames. A bookshelf built from reclaimed wood held well-worn novels, children's storybooks, and a small Bible whose pages had clearly been read many times. Callan realized that while he had spent years wondering whether Evelyn had found happiness, the answer had been sitting in front of him all along. Happiness had never come from having an easy life. It had come from the love she poured into the people around her every single day. Lila offered him a seat, while Owen eagerly disappeared into his bedroom, before returning with a model airplane he had been building for weeks. "Mom says you're good at fixing things," Owen said hopefully. "Can you help me finish this?" Callan smiled. "I'd be honored." They sat together at the kitchen table, carefully attaching the final wing. Watching them, Evelyn couldn't stop smiling. She had spent years wishing her children had more family. Now, in the space of a single afternoon, they had gained an uncle who already cared for them more deeply than they could possibly understand. As evening approached, Callan reached into the leather bag one final time and removed the large sealed envelope Evelyn had noticed earlier. He placed it gently on the dining table. "Before I leave tonight," he said quietly, "there's one more thing we need to talk about." Evelyn looked at the envelope with curiosity. "What is it?" Instead of answering immediately, Callan glanced around the apartment once more. "Do you remember the first night you moved here?" Evelyn nodded. "I was terrified. It was the only place I could afford after selling the house." Callan smiled gently. "I remember reading the application. You apologized for your credit score before anyone even asked about it. You wrote that you didn't need a perfect apartment. You only needed a safe one for your children." Evelyn laughed softly. "I really wrote that?" "Every word," Callan replied. "And from that day forward, I promised myself something. No matter what happened, you would never have to pack another box, because you couldn't afford a place to live." He slowly pushed the envelope toward her. "Go ahead." Evelyn opened it carefully. Inside was a neatly organized collection of legal documents. At first, she didn't understand what she was reading. Then her eyes stopped on the property deed. The registered owner, listed beneath the address, was no longer the real estate company. It was Evelyn Mercer. She looked up in complete disbelief. "Callan, what is this?" He smiled, his voice calm but emotional. "Apartment 3B doesn't belong to my company anymore. It belongs to you." The room fell completely silent. Lila looked from her mother to her uncle without fully understanding what had just happened. Owen frowned thoughtfully. "Does that mean we don't have to move anymore?" Callan turned toward him with a warm smile. "No, buddy. It means this is your home now." Owen's face lit up before he ran across the room and hugged his mother tightly. Evelyn, however, remained frozen, still holding the deed in trembling hands. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "It's too much." Callan shook his head. "No, it isn't." She looked at him, tears once again filling her eyes. "You've already given me my brother back. That's more than enough." Callan reached across the table and gently rested his hand over hers. "Listen to me, Evie. When we were children, we lost our home. Then we lost each other. I couldn't stop either of those things. I've lived with that regret almost every day since. But today, I can make one promise with absolute certainty. Your children will never wonder whether they'll have a roof over their heads because of money. They'll grow up knowing this apartment is theirs for as long as they need it. I'm not trying to erase the past. I simply don't want history repeating itself." Evelyn lowered her head and quietly cried. For the first time since Graham's passing, the fear that had followed her every month when rent came due simply disappeared. A few days later, Callan invited Evelyn, Lila, Owen, and Aunt Lorraine to join him at a quiet cemetery on the edge of town. The autumn leaves drifted gently through the cool afternoon air as they walked together toward a modest headstone bearing the names of their parents. Evelyn had never visited before because she had never known exactly where they rested. Callan had visited every birthday, every Christmas, and every anniversary for nearly 3 decades. He knelt first and carefully placed fresh white lilies beside the stone. Evelyn followed, laying the childhood drawing between the flowers for a brief moment before tucking it safely away again. She removed the silver bracelet from her wrist, while Callan did the same. Side by side, they placed the matching bracelets at the foot of the headstone. They no longer needed them as symbols of a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The promise had finally been kept. After several quiet minutes, Evelyn smiled through tears. "I think Mom knew we'd find each other someday." Callan looked toward the clear blue sky and nodded gently. She never stopped believing in family. Maybe that's why neither of us ever gave up either. Life slowly found a new rhythm in the months that followed. Sundays became family dinners, with Callan arriving early just to argue playfully with Owen over which football team would win that week, and helping Lila prepare for college applications. Evelyn no longer carried every burden alone. She still worked hard, because that was simply who she was. But now she had someone who insisted on sharing life's responsibilities instead of watching from a distance. The anonymous acts of kindness disappeared because they were no longer necessary. Kindness now had a face, a voice, and a seat at the family table. Neighbors who had quietly admired Evelyn's strength for years soon noticed something different about her. The worry that had once lingered behind her smile had been replaced by a peace they couldn't quite explain. When they asked what had changed, she simply answered, "I found my family." She never felt the need to tell the entire story. Some blessings were too personal to summarize in a single conversation. As we come to the end of this remarkable journey, perhaps the greatest lesson isn't about coincidence or luck. It's about promises. A frightened 10-year-old boy made one simple promise to his little sister during the darkest day of their lives. Nearly 30 years later, he fulfilled it. The road between those moments was filled with heartbreak, missed opportunities, difficult decisions, and years of silence. Yet love proved stronger than every mile that separated them. It reminds us that family isn't defined only by the years we spend together. Sometimes, it's defined by the determination to keep searching, even when hope feels distant. If Evelyn had stopped asking questions, the truth might have remained hidden. If Callan had stopped believing, the reunion would never have happened. Their story is a reminder that even after life's deepest losses, healing can arrive when we least expect it, often through people we believed were gone forever. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and tell us what moment stayed with you the most. Do you think you could have forgiven Callan for waiting 5 years after finding Evelyn, or would you have struggled to move past those lost years? We'd love to hear your thoughts, because every family has a story, and every perspective matters. If you enjoy heartfelt documentaries filled with hope, resilience, and unforgettable reunions, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Until next time, remember that sometimes the people we're searching for are searching just as hard for us, and one promise kept can change generations forever.